Hello, NAS 4983. This is your instructor, Amy, and today for Module 5, we are going to talk about second language acquisition. This is the first of the two lectures that you should be watching. The second is about teaching methods and teacher training. So, in the supplemental resources, there is a second PowerPoint presentation in PDF format that is about second language acquisition. Definitely review that. It's got a lot of great points and information in a more accessible format. This one's a little technical, but this one is the one that is about half of your Module 5 test. So you definitely want to study this lecture, but you can check the other one out too. Okay. It's one of my favorite memes. So it is true, your brain can effortlessly learn any language, but only while you're too young to care. Everyone has a innate capacity to learn any language, depending on how much of that language that you hear. It depends on the input, and there is a critical period, age frame, where you will become completely fluent in a language. So this presentation has a lot of definitions, and so pay attention to the definitions. You're definitely going to see them on the Module 5 quiz. So first off, we're going to define first language and second language. I've used the abbreviations L1 and L2 to represent your first and second languages. You will see in linguistic literature L3, L4. Sometimes I've seen L2 plus. Or just L2 with like a lowercase s, like L2's multiple second languages. All of these I've seen before. So your first language is different than any L2s because it is acquired subconsciously from birth. It says possibly before, it is absolutely before. Speakers usually have perfect pronunciation, and there's always variation among not just like different regions and different dialects of the same language, but there's also differences in between individual people on how they pronounce things in different ways. Maybe they have like a larger sinus cavity and everything sounds deeper, or maybe they say their R's funny. Maybe there's some kind of structural challenge in their mouth that makes certain sounds like S's more difficult. So there's always going to be variation, but usually there's, an acceptable like median. They'll have perfect pronunciation and then nearly unlimited vocabulary. Of course, you learn new words throughout your life, but even if you didn't go to school, on TV, you would hear enough words, right, to know unlimited vocabulary. And mastery of grammatical structures. That means you can ask a question. You can tell someone that they have to go do something. You can talk about things in the past and in the future. And then you're able to recognize ungrammatical forms. So you can tell when someone doesn't say something right. And maybe they said it wrong on purpose to make a joke. Maybe they are a learner of English or whatever your first language is, and they made a mistake. Or maybe it's a slang version of it. But you'll be able to tell when someone uses it wrong. You might not be able to explain why. You just might say, we don't say it like that. And L2 is any other language other than your first language that you learn. So this is not acquired subconsciously from birth. And of course, a bilingual person might learn two languages subconsciously from birth. But a second language is a language that you learn outside of that critical period. It's learned consciously. Speakers rarely achieve perfect pronunciation, with exceptions. They will have limited vocabulary, and they will have different degrees of mastery of grammatical structures. So maybe they can talk about things in the past, but it's really hard for them to talk about things in the future, or they don't, they don't use certain words correctly. And they may not be able to tell when they're saying something wrong. And like it says here, bilinguals learn those L1s at the same time if they're like truly bilingual from birth, or mostly during that critical period. So, what is second language acquisition then? So, now that we know that a second language is learned consciously and that there's all these kind of limitations to it, second language acquisition is the process by which people learned a second language. So, how are you learning that language outside of that critical period? And so, here's some more definitions. Interlanguage. It says an idiolect. This just means a way of talking about of something that has been developed by a learner of an L2, which preserves some features of their L1 and overgeneralize some of their L2. So this is like a mixture, a Spanglish, if you will, a mixture of that first language and the second language that, the learner has developed. And it's got some things right, but not everything. Language transfer is when your first language has influence on your learning of a second language. So maybe the way that we say T's in English, for example, is one of 3 different ways that you can say T in the Kiowa language. And so a lot of learners of the Kiowa language tend to make all the T sounds the same as the English T sound, and so it never quite sounds right. There's other language examples for that as well. Think about people who are Japanese and try to say R's and L's. They have a hard time with it. That's because they don't have that sound in their language, and so they're getting transferred from their first language. Input is the amount of the second language that the learner is exposed to. And input can be anything in the language: audio, visual, reading, writing, speaking, listening. It's all of this, any exposure to the language. Input is, I'm going to spoiler alert, input is the most critical, the absolute most critical component of second language acquisition. The more input that you have, the more statistically likely you are going to acquire the language. It's all about input. How much are you exposed to? It can't be like an hour a day. It can be, but it needs to be. If you truly want to acquire, you're going to need longer periods of immersion, and immersion doesn't have to be like you trying to speak, but like listening to it, listening to recordings, listening to TV shows, podcasts, listening to it, and then at the very beginning repeating it. It's all about input. Learning versus acquisition. So learning is that conscious process, whereas acquisition is the subconscious process. So when you're taking a class, you're learning, but when you're kind of chit and chatting with someone and you're able to like use the language correctly, then you've gone beyond learning and you have acquired some of it. Second language attrition. So this is a loss of a second language due to lack of exposure or use of that language. Unfortunately, with our Native American communities, we see this a lot in middle-aged and slightly older than middle-aged populations, where they had a lot of their heritage language. They were second language user for sure, but they had a lot of it when they were younger or at a different time in their life, and now they've just kind of forgotten some things, and it's harder for them to remember. And so it's use it or lose it for sure with language. So now we're going to do some comparisons with first language acquisition. I talked about with the meme, everyone has an innate capacity. This is your inborn genetic ability to learn languages. If you are a person, you have this. Universal grammar is this kind of hardwired knowledge of how languages work that allows children to learn any language. This is a theory by a linguist called Noam Chomsky that is pretty much accepted, that basically says, in our brains, it already knows how to do a language. It is set up for any language. You just need that input to determine which one. But that's how we all have that innate capacity. The language acquisition device is not an actual device, but it is a proposed part of the brain where this kind of, it says in universal grammar that how to speak a language is like hardwired into our brain. We just know how to do it. The language acquisition device is that part of your brain that knows how to speak a language. So, it's this part of the brain that allows for effortless language learning during the critical period. It is the part of your brain dedicated to language, learning a language and becoming fluent in it so quickly. And theoretically, if this part of the brain was damaged, then somebody would not be able to develop language. And we know that happens. There's a condition called aphasia, that brain damage or trauma can cause aphasia to happen. And so it's very possible that there is a place in the brain that is about language. So it is possible to have more than one first language. Think of our bilingual friends who learn 2 languages at the same time. There's a teaching method called one person, one language, where say mom speaks only English and dad speaks only Cherokee to the baby. And, that's how they grow up with that. There's a lot of TikToks about that. But it is possible to have an L3 as well. Studies have shown that babies in the womb can hear and learn the sounds of their first language. So there's a study, and I believe it was Swedish women and American women, after they gave birth to their babies, like within a couple hours of giving birth to their babies were hooked up to a monitor that was inside of a pacifier. And so they measured for a certain amount of time how long the baby was sucking on the pacifier to get like a base level of their rhythm of sucking on the pacifier. And then once they had that base, they played for the babies sounds of their mother making vowel sounds. So like A, I, E, O, U, like those vowel sounds in their language. So the Swedish women in Swedish and the American women in English. And so it'd just be like ah, E, A. Well, Swedish has some vowel sounds that English doesn't have, and English has some that Swedish doesn't have. And so they also threw in those other sounds. And it was the same voice that said the sounds. And so they were able to measure from how the baby's sucking rate on the pacifier changed if they were listening or paying attention to certain sounds over other sounds. And they were able to show in every time that they did this experiment that babies would recognize sounds that were not familiar, like not part of their mother's language, the vowel sounds they had never heard before, and they would stop and pause and think about those sounds. And so it's very interesting that before you're even born, you can recognize at least the vowel sounds of your first language. Acquisition occurs passively and subconsciously through implicit learning. So we'll talk more about different learning styles in the next presentation for this unit. But when you implicit and explicit is I'm showing you. So like maybe I write I am happy in English, and then I write je suis content, I am happy in French, right underneath it, and I show you, this is je, this means I, suis, this is how you say am. And it's going to change for you or he or you all or they, but suis is the one for I am. And then content, it looks like the English content, it means happy. So that was an explicit, really talking about. Implicit learning is where you kind of have to figure it out, and no one tells you what you're doing. So like maybe playing a game or just listening to a person speak the language, and then they like pick up something like a book and then say what the word for book is in the language, and you have to, they don't tell you, but you have to figure it out. That's implicit learning, and that's really how, from doing that over and over, that in a fun kind of way, that you learn a language. This critical period that we've talked about, that is birth to about 12. So once puberty kicks in, that part of the language acquisition device, that part of the brain really stops doing the whole language learning thing, and the body really starts focusing, the brain starts focusing on puberty, getting the body mature for, sexual maturity, and it really just like shuts down. And that's where that effortless learning is, in that birth to 12. It's after that it gets harder and harder, and the more that you pass through puberty, the body and the brain are just doing other things, and so you don't have that same capacity. You must receive adequate input during the critical period for acquisition. So if there was an unfortunate child that was not raised around anybody that talked to them in any language when they were little, if they did not receive enough input during the critical period, then they did not learn to speak any language. They had the innate capacity to do it. They were hardwired to be able to do it, but because they did not receive input, they just didn't. And so linguists like to study feral children and other children who were raised in strange things, to see how, without input, what does the brain do for language. So speaking of that, in the 1930s, 6-year-old Isabel was discovered hidden away in a dark room with a deaf-mute mother as her only contact. She was taught to speak by age 8 and appeared to be normal. So Isabel was in that critical period, and she was able to learn, with input, how to speak, and was considered a fluent speaker of her language. So Isabel, was able to get through the critical period with learning a language. In the 70s, there was 13-year-old Jeannie, who was brought by her mother to social services after escaping their mentally ill father. Until the mother's escape, had no language input and very horrific living conditions. By 17, she had a 5-year-old's vocabulary and could express meanings by combining words together. So Jeannie was discovered after her critical period had closed, and not by much, but definitely after. And it took 4 years for her to be able to speak like a 5-year-old, whereas it only took 2 years for Isabel to become fluent. So it is also possible, though, that Jeannie may have had other cognitive disabilities, but a large part of her issue was that she did not receive input until after the critical period had closed. So first language acquisition under 6 months is silent period, followed by babbling. 6 to 10, babbling becomes language specific. So by 6 months old, and definitely before a year, the babies have figured out the sounds of their language. So in that, first part of babbling, they're just making sounds, any sounds that their mouth can make. But in that 6 to 10 month window, babies have figured out how to babble in, like, M is usually one of the first one, ma 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 ma, and P pa 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 pa, and B ba 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 bye 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 bye. And they're learning to babble in the sounds of their language, and they're starting to tune out the other sounds. Now they'll still do, maybe make those sounds, but they're starting to tune out to them. They're not listening for them anymore. And soon they'll stop making them as much, for sure, because it's just not part of the language. 12 to 18 months is when you get those first single word sentences, mostly nouns. My baby's first words were moon and dog. But my son was pointing to a balloon when he said moon, but he was calling it the moon. And 2 simple word sentences. So, I used to get, because I made my boys say please a lot, so I could drink please, bite please, a lot of those kind of sentences. Natural order hypothesis. The natural order hypothesis says that children acquire the different parts of a grammar in a, like, predictable order, so that you're going to learn how to do this and then do that, and every step will be predictable. And for the most part, it's true. The natural order hypothesis does, for a lot of commonly learned languages, we know for sure that those grammatical structures are acquired in that way. Okay, so remember, second language acquisition is different. This is the process whereby humans, outside of that critical period, learn a language. It is active and it is conscious through explicit instruction and education. It can be implicit sometimes, but like a lot of explicit instruction. Second language learners must retrain their brain to accept language systems outside of the confines of their first language. So you're trying to get rid of interference and language transfer. Language transfer, when you're just kind of putting your language systems on top of the other language. There is some evidence that the natural order hypothesis applies to second language learning too, but it doesn't always look exactly the same. You don't have 6 months usually to just be silent and babble. It goes a lot faster, and a lot of second language theories are communicative, learning things that you can say to actually talk to other people. So that's why you learn things like hello, how are you, when little kids wouldn't learn that in the same way. Second language acquisition, SLA theories. So the big thing is motivation. So I said input was the most important factor. I lied. It's motivation is the most important factor to determine if you're going to be successful. It is not who is smartest. It's not who has a talent for it. It is not, a lot of times even, it's not necessarily who works the hardest for it. It is who is motivated the most to learn, a desire to learn, an attitude towards learning, and motivational intensity. So it's really, there's lots of variables, but it's really important to know, like, to have a strong motivation to learn another language. So another theory is immersion. So when we talk about immersion, that is when you are just constantly receiving input from the other language, from the L2. So that 100%, if you went to an immersion school, 100% of your school day would be in the second language. You would have math in your second language. You would have history. You would have gym. You would, all the activities of your day would be in that second language. And then maybe you would have like a class just about your first language, like we have English class, same kind of thing. You have English class in English, but the rest of the day. Um, Total immersion, though, would be then coming home from school and only hearing that language on the radio in the car, and then hearing it on the TV in your house, and then talking to your family in that language. And so that would be actual total immersion. But immersion schools are a set period of time that is total immersion. Partial immersion, in those kind of programs, class time is shared between the first language and second language. A lot of times it's like directly translated. Like you do a lesson, a part of a lesson in the first language, say English, and then you do the lesson, that part of the lesson again, but you do it in Spanish, and then you do the next part of it in Spanish, and then you go over that again in English, and just kind of back and forth all day, or two people talking at the same time, not at the same time, but like co-teachers, where one teacher is only in Spanish and the other is only in English, and they do different parts of the thing, whatever they're doing throughout the day, but one only does it in Spanish and one only does it in English. Partial immersion or dual immersion can actually be really great programs, especially really good for students that come from different countries to the United States. It works well for them. And then there's two-way immersion. Bilingual immersion is to integrate both the students of the minority language and the students of the majority language in the same classroom, with the goal of academic excellence bilingual. And this is very similar to the dual immersion or the partial immersion programs. Okay, so another second language acquisition theory, and this is probably a really important one too, the affective filter. I'm a big time believer in the affective filter. This guy, Stephen Krashen, a lot of people don't like Krashen. I've heard people say Krashen Bashen, but he said that there's this imaginary screen in your brain, right? And the screen goes up and it blocks things from getting into your brain, and the screen goes down and it's like things can pass through. When it's down, you're like chill, you're relaxed, you're in a good mood, you're receptive to learning, and you're having fun. When it's raised, you are stressed and you are not having fun. It is a high pressure situation, so it's not good. So, the way, and remember, when the screen is up, like nothing can get through. Like information input just bounces off of it. But when it's down, the input kind of sticks in your brain, whatever you're learning. And this is for language, but it can relate to a lot of different things. So, therefore, the best way to learn a language is to make sure the affective filter is down. And I personally experienced this when I was very good at French in high school, and in university I did great on my papers. I, could say a lot of things, but I had speaker anxiety. I could understand you real good, but I wouldn't want to talk in front of French people. It made me super nervous, or people I knew that were really high level, and just kind of clam up, and like, it was hard. It was difficult being on the spot like that. And that was my affective filter blocking the input, and I couldn't think of what to say. I didn't understand what they were saying. And so when I was relaxed and playing games and having fun with my friends in class, then I was able to use French very effectively. So if you're a language learner, think about your affective filter and ways to lower it. And if you're a language teacher, how can you make an environment for your students that is conducive to a lowered affective filter? Okay, so a bunch more definitions. I told you this one was heavy. You got interaction hypothesis, output hypothesis, and competition model. So with the interaction hypothesis, so It's all about using the language. Language acquisition is strongly facilitated by the use of the target language in interaction. So it's like actually talking to other people. Comprehensible input is important for language learning. In addition, it claims that the effectiveness of the input is greatly increased when learners have to negotiate for meaning. So, negotiating for meaning is like, when you don't know how to say something and you start describing it. So, in our first language, we do this a lot when we can't think of someone's name, and so we just say, from that show, and he's got the dark hair, and and you start describing them either physically or how you know them, things like that, until the other person is able to feed you their name. Negotiating for meaning is very similar. Let's say you're having a conversation and you forget how to say the word for a banana, which would be dumb because in a lot of languages banana is just banana, but maybe not. And so you start describing it. It's a food. You eat it. It's yellow. It's long. And then your friend's like, a banana, and you're like, yes, a banana. So that's negotiating for meaning. And so when you have to think about how to describe something and find common ground and understanding is when you're really learning the best. Output hypothesis. So, yes, input is insanely important. It's one of the top 2 things that you need to be able to acquire language, but you also need output. And so you need to be able to write in the language. You need to be able to speak in the language to a certain degree to be able to truly acquire it. However, it says most studies have shown little, if any, correlation between learning and the quantity of output. So it doesn't necessarily work like the more output you make, the better you're going to learn. But you do definitely have to use output to be able to make meaningful input and to learn the language. The competition model says that individuals use linguistic cues to get meaning from language rather than relying on linguistic universals. According to this theory, when you acquire a second language, learners sometimes receive competing cues and must decide which cues is more relevant for determining meaning. I'll just leave that there. So here's some more hypotheses. I'm not going to read these to you guys, but definitely check out all of these wonderful theories. So, why should you be multilingual? And every single person who is in my class or ever watches this video, you should definitely be multilingual. Here's some benefits. Learning a second language improves problem-solving skills and math ability. Math, music, and language are all very closely related in the brain. A lot of linguists are musicians, and some are quite brilliant mathematicians. I am not, but I am a musician, and we know that learning music also affects mathematical ability, and so it's all in that same general area in the brain. Bilinguals are better at multitasking. Bilinguals are better at tasks that involve conflicting information, so they're better at analyzing data. Bilinguals show an increased analytical orientation to language, so they're just better at using language by knowing multiple languages. Bilinguals have less incidence of dementia, improved memory, improved attention, and better verbal reasoning skills. So it is believed that by learning multiple languages, you create new pathways in the brain that would not have existed otherwise if you had only spoken one language. And because you have more of that neural net, more of those pathways in your brain, as age and disease like dementia start to shut down parts of the brain, there's more of a backup system, a back road system that your brain can use. So that's why there's less dementia symptoms and better attention, because there's just more pathways in the brain. And I had also read, I can't cite this because I don't remember where I read it, but I had read that there's an area in a country where a lot of people speak 3 languages. They're trilingual, and they have almost no incidence of dementia ever. There's have been like trauma that people have had that's caused memory issues, but almost no incidence of dementia. And they believe that it's because they have so many backup pathways by being fluent in 3 languages that it doesn't break down the same way. Brain size can increase with multiple languages. Again, you're building more of those pathways. Bilinguals use more of their neural landscape than monolinguals. That's the actual like areas of your brain. You're using more parts of your brain. Of course, there's money as a motivation, better job opportunities, increased self-esteem, especially with indigenous heritage languages. They've shown programs with troubled youth and with prisoners where learning their heritage language has caused huge gains in their self-esteem. There's also been high school students who have talked about their increased self-esteem because of learning their heritage languages. There's increased creativity, and there's definitely more cultural sensitivity. I think if you can learn another language, whether you're fluent or not, you're at least more aware of there are different kinds of people in the world, and that they can think in very different kinds of ways, and that's okay. So polyglots. Watch this link on polyglots. I'll make sure to put it in the viewing resources. So a lot of people say they're polyglots. There is a guy that I really like watching his YouTube videos. His name is Xiaoma NYC. And his thing will say polyglot speaks perfect Chinese and shocks natives. And so, yeah, absolutely, he does speak really good Chinese, and he does speak multiple different languages. He's not a polyglot, though. A true polyglot, and it's sometimes used just for anyone who speaks more than one language. A true polyglot is a person who has a type of savant syndrome. They have something on the autism spectrum that has impoverished language skills as part of their basic disability. So they do have trouble with certain kinds of vocabulary and certain ways of speaking. But they also are extremely talented in something. In this case, it's languages. They have an innate, a better innate ability to learn language. It's really, really rare. There's a really great video, I think it's a PBS video, about a guy in England that's a true polyglot, and he learned like Icelandic in a week on TV. He didn't just do it, he did it like with a Icelandic TV show, and he was able to. So it's a really shocking kind of skill, and it is definitely not just someone who's taken a lot of language classes. It is a type of disability. Okay, so that is all I have for the presentation. Real quick, I wanted to show you some things. Actually, nope, I'm going to save that for the next video. So thank you guys, and we will see you for teacher training and teacher foreign language teaching method.